Hello, BookTube. This is the last day of June today. It's the 30th. And so I thought I would film my June wrap-up. Um, I doubt I will finish anything today, and if I do, I will just include it in with my books in July. I read 9 books in June, and so I want to talk to you about them, some in more detail than others, because some of them I've already talked about and reviewed on my channel. And then I have some that I don't have copies of because they were books that I got at my library, and I have since returned them, and so I don't have a physical copy to show you for those books. But anyway, let's just get into the reviews, but first, coffee. Alright, so the first book I read in June was a graphic novel, and that is Wonder Woman Tempesttossed, written by Laurie Halse Anderson and illustrated by Layla Del Duca, sorry. Inside, this is a reimagining of the origins of Wonder Woman, and this is also a story about the refugee experience, about teenage activism, and sort of finding the strength to create change. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. I am so glad that I got this. I don't tend to always enjoy graphic novels, but this one was just lovely. And I pretty much will auto-buy anything Laurie Halse Anderson writes. She's one of my favorite authors, even though I don't really read a lot of YA anymore. But if it's Laurie Halse Anderson, I will probably buy it and read it, because she's just a fabulous author and a fabulous human, and I can't recommend this graphic novel enough. It was so good. I think I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. The next book that I read in June, I have already reviewed on my channel, so I'm not going to really talk about it here, but I want to mention it, and that is Like a Sword Wound by Ahmet Altan. I really love this book. I have more thoughts about it in my review that I will link down below, so you should check that out. But that was the second book I read in June. The third book that I read was The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. This was an odd book. It takes place in London in 1855, and the Babbage engines are starting to power the Industrial Revolution, and we follow this cast of characters from Sybil Gerard, who is a prostitute, to Edward Mallory, who's a paleontologist, and then also Lady Ada Byron sort of makes an appearance, although she's not, like, really the main focus of the book. It goes in directions that I didn't really expect it to. Like, I really enjoyed parts of it, and then not so much other parts, and I felt like the Babbage engines didn't play as big of a role in this as I wanted them to. So, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this book, and I'm not really sure how to talk about it, because, like I said, it was odd in a lot of ways, and yeah, I don't know. I'm glad I read it just to be able to say I read another of the SF Masterworks, but it was one of those books that I'm not really sure I have coherent thoughts about, so we're just going to leave it at that. And then I read The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family by Betty Kearse, and this was a library book, so I don't have a physical copy with me. I've talked about this book as part of my favorite books so far in 2020. It was one of my favorite nonfiction books. And basically, Betty Kearse is a descendant of the President James Madison. And in this book, she is tracing her history and her ancestors and looking at how her family is related to this president. And talks also about slavery and racism, and when she goes to some of the different places to do research about her family's origins, she still encounters racism. It's in the South, so there's that. Anyway, and then she also talks about how her mother, before her mom passed away, said that Betty was designated as the storyteller of their family's history. and they had a specific name for it, which I can't remember now. But anyway, so that was part of what inspired Betty to write this book. And it was just absolutely fascinating to see how this is both, this being related to a president is both something of pride to them, but also yet something that they understand is also a negative. So I really enjoyed this book as well. Like I said, it's one of my favorite nonfiction books so far of 2020, and definitely one of my favorite reads of June. And I highly encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. The next book I read was for the one book, one Emporia read that I'm doing for with my community, and that is Lab Girl by Hope Jaron. And in this book we follow geologist Hope Jaron. This is a nonfiction book where she talks about her time as an academic and a geologist studying trees, flowers, soil, all of those things that you study in that field. And she goes through how she became interested in these things when she was a little girl with her father. She would go to his lab at the community college where he worked with him and see all the things that he was doing there, and so that got her interested in science. And then it moves through her leaving her family to go on to university and then gain her PhD and the struggles that she encountered in doing those things, especially in becoming a female academic. And this was not just a book about science, in my opinion. It was also a book about the struggles of academe and the ways in which academe can be such a hard environment to deal with. She never has enough money for the experiments that she wants to conduct. At points, she hardly has enough money to live. She can barely pay her assistant any money at all. He's homeless at one point. So this was just as much a commentary, in my opinion, especially as someone who is an academe. It was just as much a commentary on being an academic as it was a book about science and nature. So I really found the intertwining of those two things to be interesting. And I really enjoyed this book. I'm looking forward to discussing it in July with people. Of course, it's on Zoom. But still, this was a great read. I really enjoyed it. And then I finished Theclavins by Anthony Trollope, which was the Consorting with Lonely Trollops read-along that Steve Donahue is doing. This was our book for June. And this was actually one of my favorites so far for the Trollope read-along. And this follows Henry Clavering. He is the first well-born Victorian to choose a career in civil engineering, which people sort of don't understand why he chooses that. He is jilted by his first love, Julia Brabazon, and he is then engaged to marry Florence Burton, who is the daughter of the gentleman whose firm he works in as an engineer. But then Julia, her husband that she marries basically for his money, dies, and she comes back into Harry's life. And the story takes off from there. And I really enjoyed this. And you definitely see the Victorian moral sense coming to light in this book of choosing between your first love and this other more virtuous person that you are engaged to, and sort of, what do you do in this situation, and how is it going to affect your future, and how is it going to affect the future of those you care about, and so yeah, I just really like this. Anthony Trollope is definitely quickly becoming one of my favorite authors thus far. And then I have 3 other books that I read, and all of these were from the library, so I don't have physical copies of them. The first one was a Tor novella, and that is Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nighi Yo, and I'm sure I am butchering that name, I apologize. And this tells the story of a, how do I describe this? A young royal from the far north is sent south for a political marriage. Um, Alone and sometimes reviled, she has only her servants on her side, and so this chronicles her rise to power through the eyes of her handmaiden, who she tells her story to. And so this is both a feminist high fantasy, and it's also an indictment of monarchy. It was really interesting. Really enjoyed this. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Tor novella, but it was still a fun, quick read that had some interesting themes. And then the other book, the second book that I read that was also from my library is This Is What America Looks Like, My Journey from Refugee to Congresswoman by Ilhan Omar. And I absolutely loved this book so much. It's the sort of memoir of Ilhan Omar, who is a congresswoman, and when she was only 8 years old, war broke out in her home country of Somalia, and she was the youngest of 7 children. Her mother had died when she was still very small, so she doesn't even remember her mother, and she's being raised by her father and her grandfather, and then war breaks out, and they end up having to leave Somalia, and they are refugees, and they live in a camp. And then she goes into the journey of them immigrating to America and her trying to find her place in America, and her struggles with adapting to the American culture, and then getting married and having kids, and then becoming a politician. And there's a lot more within this book than just those broad strokes, but it was still just fabulous. Like I said, this was probably one of my favorite reads in June. I loved this book and a lot of the themes that it talked about. And it was fascinating to read more about Ilhan's experience because I didn't know much about her prior to reading this. So I'm really glad I picked this one up. And then the last book that I read was called The Emissary by Yoko Tawada, and this is sort of a dystopian type novel, I guess you could say. Actually, I guess it's a novella. It was really short. I read it on my Kindle, and this takes place in Japan, and after suffering from an irreparable disaster, Japan cuts itself off from the rest of the world, so it's very isolated. And in this book, the children are very weak. They can barely stand or walk, and they are deteriorating in health very rapidly. While the people who have the energy and are more, what do I want to say, more childlike as we see it in their energy and personality, are actually the elderly. And so this follows Mumai, who lives with his grandfather Yoshiro, and his grandfather worries about him constantly because of his poor health, his weak state. And so this is sort of a commentary on this idea of the children being the ones who are in poor health, and then the elderly being the ones who are, more energetic and act in the way we perceive the young to act. So it kind of turns the tables. And so this is just a really interesting book to read in that respect. And Mumai and his grandfather as characters, I think you just get attached to both of them, because they both care about each other so deeply. And Mumai, despite his uh, weak state, is still, very optimistic and hopeful. And then his grandfather, of course, who worries about him, is just, a sweet, wonderful character. And so, yeah, this was just a surprising read for me because I really enjoyed it, much more than I thought I would. And I'm really glad I picked it up on my Kindle and read it because I really liked it. I read it all in like one day. Because it was, like I said, a quick read, and then it was also just fun to read as well. So that was The Emissary. It was also, by the way, translated by Margaret Mitsutani. So yeah, that was another book that I really enjoyed this month. And that was all 9 of the books that I read in the month of June. Please let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. Or if you would like to read any of these books, leave me a comment down below, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks, BookTube.